Welcome to the Silver Screen Guide podcast. Join Corbin and Allen, along with guest hosts, as they bring their love for the cinema to discuss films from every genre and decade. Learn about the history of the film, little-known facts, and insightful explorations while they enjoy discussing your favorite film. The curtain is rising and your podcast is starting, so sit back, relax, and enjoy your guide to the silver screen.
Welcome, listeners, to a very special podcast. This is my birthday pick. Woohoo!
Happy birthday, Corbin.
Thank you, Alan. I appreciate it. I am very old now. I'm coming up on my 70th birthday.
Yeah, you look like it.
I look like it. I'm about as old as this movie we're talking about. This film is nearing its 90th birthday. If you clicked on it, you know what we're talking about. We are reviewing and talking about the history and the legacy of King Kong, the eighth wonder of the world, which was released way back March 2nd, 1933. If you were lucky enough to be living in New York and you had money during this is during the Great Depression, mind you.
Yep.
So it was released at Radio City, but to the larger public, it was released April 7th, 1933. Now, I came to this movie when I was very young. This is actually one of my earliest memories. I was in kindergarten at the time when I saw this movie. So I want to say I was around 5 years old, probably. Okay. And I have vivid memories of popping this movie on. I believe we owned it on VHS, and I remember grabbing my sour cream and chive Pringles.
Ah, yes.
And just having a good time, just watching King Kong. And that is one of my earliest memories. And that is the first full length movie I remember watching. And honestly, that's what got me into movies in the first place.
Gotcha. I have not. I've seen the ending probably like 20 minutes or so.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think I caught it on TV, if I'm not mistaken.
I feel like this happens to you frequently.
Yeah, there was a moment in time where, for whatever reason, I caught like every great movie. I always caught the last like 30 minutes of it. Like that happened with the Shawshank Redemption.
Oh.
It happened with King Kong. There's a few others I'm sure that it happened to. But yeah, so this was one of those that I caught the very tail end of. And I remember thinking that this was super interesting. At the time, I was kind of a newbie to film. I wasn't like super into it as I am now. And this movie really interested me because I had always known about it, but I never like actually watched it. And seeing that, animated the animated monkey really intrigued me. So I never really got around to it. Never really had, I guess, an excuse to watch it until you brought it up for your birthday pick.
And I think that's probably the one thing that interests a lot of people about this movie is this old black and white movie with a giant gorilla terrorizing people. Yeah. And King Kong scaling the Empire State Building and holding a beautiful woman in his hands and fighting airplanes. That's iconic.
Yeah, that's been an iconic just shot in general of a giant monkey, or it's just a giant thing on top of the Empire State Building. I believe Rampage is a game that really took that to like the next level. Yeah, where it's just giant animals just destroying a city and fighting each other. So.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. And of course, a lot of people think of Godzilla as more of the Japanese giant monster. And the two of them did come head to head. I'll bring that up a little later on towards the end of the podcast. And we are getting a new King Kong film this year. It's King Kong versus Godzilla. They're doing a remake, so I'm intrigued to see that. But yeah, before we get too far into the actual movie itself, I do want to talk about how this movie came together, because it's a really fascinating history. And this is the beginning of what we know today as, honestly, modern cinema. Especially so many movies rely on visual effects and sound effects. this is where it all began. This was wholly new to Hollywood. It's really incredible. So the two directors of the film were Marion C. Cooper and Ernest B. Schoedsack, who were friends. They had met during World War I, and they kind of, lost contact because they were both in the war fighting. And then they regained connection in Hollywood, and they were both huge into documentaries. And they said, let's go. We're like super big adventure seekers. Let's go film lions. And there's no such thing as a zoom on a camera back then. So they had to get face up in the lions. It's really incredible. So when Marion C. Cooper was a young boy, he liked to read Kipling, who wrote The Jungle Book, and Haggard, Shakespeare, and the Bible. So one of his first books that was given to him from his uncle was Equatorial Africa, and that began his fascination with gorillas. So, and another interesting thing is, while watching this movie, one of the main characters is Carl Denham, who is the movie maker. Mm-hmm. Well, There's no surprise to this. Carl Denham is fashioned after Cooper himself, and Schoedsack is fashioned after Jack Driscoll. And even their heights are similar because Schoedsack was very tall and Cooper was very short, just like their characters on screen.
Gotcha.
So in a way, they're kind of writing this movie about themselves. Now, some of their very early films were Chang and Grass, which I would love to see. They called them natural dramas. So
that's an interesting name for them.
Yeah, so they really weren't. They were kind of very early documentaries, but they were also trying to kind of tell a real life story with them. And some of the scenes from Chang and Grass, they brought into King Kong. They filmed a scene of a herd of elephants stampeding a village, which gave them the idea of King Kong destroying the village. Now, Schoedsack did meet a woman by the name of Ruth Rose, and they met on a ship, just like Jack and Ann do in this movie. And the two of them fell in love, and they got married. Now, another person who is integral to the making of this film is Willis O'Brien. Now, Cooper and O'Brien met in 1931. Cooper couldn't figure out, he had this idea of making a film about people going to an island, encountering a giant gorilla and like all these like prehistoric creatures. Nothing like that had ever been done before. And Cooper couldn't really figure out how in the world can we visualize that? Because remember, there was no such thing as computers, and hand-drawn animation was in its early stages as well. There really wasn't a lot of feature films. Snow White was one of the major feature films to incorporate complete animation, which was up for Best Picture of the Year at the time. So as I said, he met Willis O'Brien in 1931, and he found O'Brien. He was the key. He was the key to bringing Kong to life on the big screen. Now, O'Brien is the pioneer, the father of visual effects.
Right.
So he invented stop motion. He was the inventor of stop motion animation.
Okay.
Now, so O'Brien at the time was fiddling around with stop motion animation, and he was being funded by none other than Thomas Edison. Yes, this is how old this is.
Yeah, I was about to say, that's when you said Thomas Edison, I was like, yeah, that's pretty old.
You know, Thomas Edison, who like invented the light bulb and electricity. Well, he just also invented the motion camera. He was the one that brought this camera to life of taking stills rapidly to make motion occur. So the very first stop motion movie ever made, the earliest one, was created by O'Brien, and it is called The Dinosaur and the Missing Link, which I've seen clips of. It's pretty incredible. And
I think I have too.
Yeah, it's for anybody who has any relative knowledge of stop motion, you may recognize this, and you'll also recognize that ending part of the title, Missing Link. You know, Leica, who just made their film Missing Link, who does stop motion animation. This has to be a tribute to O'Brien's very first film.
That's right. And like the birth of stop motion in general.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So O'Brien went on to make another film that I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with. They may not have seen it, 1925's The Lost World. But Steven Spielberg did take this title, The Lost World, and incorporate it into Jurassic Park, The Lost World, which The Lost World in itself is derived from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's book.
Right.
And I found this to be really interesting. It's kind of hilarious. So nobody had seen stop motion really at the time, not in mass. This was the first time people had seen it. And when they brought it to movie studios, they said this was real life documentary footage. They had found dinosaurs and legitimately filmed them. And they believed them. Yeah, they believed them until they had to come around and be like, well, we can't keep this ruse up forever. No, we created this.
Right. That's funny.
So originally, O'Brien was working at the RKO Studios on a film called Creation. And I want to put these numbers into perspective for what Creation would have cost at the time. So at the time in the very early 30s, they had invested $100,000 on a couple minutes of footage.
Right. Which is, of course, by today's standards, $100,000 is because of inflation, way, way more than that back in the 30s.
Oh, absolutely. And it was interesting because on this documentary I watched with my disc, Peter Jackson had a lot to say about it. And as some of you may know, Peter Jackson, who of course did the Lord of the Rings trilogy, he also did a remake and slight reimagining of King Kong in 2005. Right. So Peter Jackson said in 1933, a big movie would have cost $2,000 for the whole budget. Now, $100,000 was spent just on a couple minutes of test footage, not actual footage. This was test footage. And so they were estimating the film to cost, Creation was going to cost about $1 million.
Yikes.
I can't imagine. That would be crazy. So the studio shut down Creation. They're like, we can't justify spending $1 million on this. But Cooper came on board and he used all of O'Brien's designs for the most part to create a new picture called The Beast, which, surprise, was later renamed King Kong. Now, if you do have the special edition of King Kong, they did kind of do some really great drawings, some of the original drawings and narration for the story of creation. And I really wish we could have got that as a movie because that would have been an incredible film. That I think I would have just loved to have seen it. A fascinating adventure. I highly recommend it. Maybe it's on YouTube. Go check out Creation. I think there's like a 5-minute kind of mini movie of what it is, but it's very fascinating, especially for the time. Now today, it would be made fairly cheaply with visual effects, but I would love to see it remade with just using stop motion animation, and live action combined. So Cooper and Schoedsack were still filming The Most Dangerous Game, which was also based off a book, and which also starred Fay Wray, who is Ann Darrow in this, and Robert Armstrong, who is Carl Denham.
Okay.
So they used the set of The Most Dangerous Game to make test reels for King Kong, and they showed that to the executives, and the executives were sold on funding King Kong. Now, you'll see this film is conceived of an idea from Cooper and Edgar Wallace. Now, Wallace originally wrote the script, but he did pass away before production even began on the movie. So Cooper brought on Creelman, who wrote the script for The Most Dangerous Game. But the problem was Cooper wasn't satisfied with Creelman's script because Creelman was having a very hard time thinking about how they could write a script of live action people interacting with gigantic creatures and weaving that into any kind of a coherent story.
Right.
So Schoedsack brought on his wife, Ruth Rose, who had written and filmed. She was a cinematographer on some of their previous movies. So the final script is done by Schoedsack's wife. We have her to thank. Now, it's kind of funny because they're going to start casting the movie. They were going to bring Fay Wray on, who was one of the most popular actresses at the time. Let this sink in, Alan. She had 11 films come out in 1933.
Whoa. That's like, we talk about The Rock having 2 movies come out. I don't know, I think it was last year. And we were thinking, that's a lot of movies for one actor. But yeah, 11 is ridiculous.
It is ridiculous. And so she was constantly working back to back. And even when they were beginning to do shooting some scenes for King Kong, Fay Wray, kind of like Michael Fox when we talked about with Back to the Future, she was just going from one set to the other, or sometimes it was the same set. And what she would do is, she was a natural brunette, so she put on her blonde wig for King Kong.
Gotcha.
And so she was like basically shooting the movies simultaneously, but of course, Most Dangerous Game wrapped up first and was released first. Now, the studio didn't want, and of course the crew involved didn't want anybody to know how they made King Kong, because nobody had ever seen anything like it before. So they released fake press material on how they made the film. And they said King Kong was done by a guy in a gorilla suit. And I can't remember everything else they did, but they released all lies to throw everybody off. And so nobody would know how the film was made.
Yeah.
And especially before the film hit mass audiences, they didn't want the public knowing how it was. Now, this was a much more common practice back then. Even we talked about this in our review of Psycho. Alfred Hitchcock mandated that when his movie was shown in theaters, that after the movie had begun, nobody was admitted to the screening because they didn't want the ending to be given away. I do also want to mention one other person in the creation of this film, Max Steiner, who did the score for this movie. And also Spivak, who did the sound effects. I'll talk more about both of those men later. I'm introducing all of these names to you up front because we will be talking about them much later on in the review, and honestly, their contribution to cinema. So this film isn't rated G, PG, or anything like that.
It's too old for that.
It's too old for that. All it did was pass. It passed.
Yes, it passed. What was it? The Hayes Code, I believe, is what it was. We had a discussion on this a couple years ago.
Yes,
about the rating system and the early days of the MPAA. Yeah, no PG, no G. Is either passed or it wasn't released at all.
That's right. So it passed, although 5 years later, they might have not been happy with their decision to pass it. We'll talk about that.
Yeah, there were some. I know that there was some censorship that went on with this movie. Quite a lot, actually.
Which, in today's terms, is just hilarious because this movie was deemed too violent.
Yeah.
For the public to see, which it's not too violent. Okay.
By today's standards,
no. I watched it when I was 5. You're going to be fine if you watch it with your kids. So it does have a 7.9 on IMDb.
Very solid score.
Which is a very solid score. I'm honestly a little surprised it's not a little bit higher. It's not on the IMDb top 250.
I am too. It's one of those movies that you think should be on the list, but for whatever reason, it just isn't.
So it was on the list in previous years, but not this year. I did compile a complete list of all of the movies that have hit the IMDb top 250 since 1996 when it was first introduced. So King Kong was on the IMDb top 250 for 11 years. And it looks like 11 years straight in a row. So it first hit the list at position 242 in 1999. Okay. And it went off the list. The last year it was on the list was 2009 at 194. So it never really moved much on the list. The lowest it ever got, it stayed in the 200s every time. The lowest it got was 187.
Okay. So it sounds like it had a pretty solid, relatively solid place on that list for a while.
Yeah, it was towards the back end, but it still had staying power for 11 years.
Right.
Now, critically, it is bulletproof, except for 2% of critics, but whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
Who knows what they're thinking, but a whopping massive 98% approval on Rotten Tomatoes with an 86% audience score. And that other one is certified fresh.
I believe it. I mean, it's one of those movies that I feel like critics understand how important it is because of its contribution to cinema. It's one of those things where it's kind of a movie that really helped kickstart animation in film. Like, not only like Steamboat Willie and what would later become Snow White, but also like integrating stop motion and other effects into film.
Oh, yeah. And we're going to touch on more of the special effects later, but it's crazy what they were able to figure out and do. It's really incredible. And of course, on Metascore, it holds a 90.
I believe it.
And that is no easy feat to get a 90 on Metascore.
Yeah. Metascore, usually they're pretty critical compared to Rotten Tomatoes and IMDb. So when you have a 90 on Metascore, it means you're doing a pretty good job.
And of course, CinemaScore wasn't invented back then.
Yeah.
I don't have any numbers for the budget or the box office. I don't know if they kept those records. I saw the number 631. Didn't make any sense to me.
I looked, IMDb didn't really have much when it came to budget or box office returns. The Wikipedia article says that it says the film was a box office success, making $2 million worldwide in rentals for its initial release. Opening weekend, 90,000. Then it dropped 50%, but that was just because it was FDR's first day in office. It says during the film's run, it made a profit of 650,000.
Okay.
So, from what I understand, it did very well in the box office. Because I know that that was when it released initially, and they released it like 3 or 4 more times past that. I think they released it in 1938, and then 1952, and then I think there were a few more times. It might even be in this article, but yeah, that was its initial release. It did, for 1933, very, very well.
Oh, yeah. It was a huge box office success, especially during the Great Depression. It really sparked people's imaginations, got them thinking, got their minds out of hard times, and it really opened up their eyes to what cinema could be. And every other movie at this time was either a musical. Musicals were starting to become popular with the introduction of sound into films, and mostly just romantic dramas were pretty much what was big at the box office and at the awards. This movie did not receive one Academy Award nomination.
Right. I know that there was one person who really wanted to get those special effects up for an Oscar, but at the time there was no special effects Oscar.
No.
Yeah.
No, the category hadn't even been invented yet because basically visual effects had not been invented yet. This movie invented visual effects.
Right.
Now, it was the studio that did produce the film was RKO Radio Productions. That's no longer in business anymore. So it was because RKO had a lot of their movies at the Academy Awards alongside Warner Brothers, Paramount, MGM. All of those movies, studios are still in business today, except for RKO.
Right. I know that we talked about another RKO production. It's a Wonderful Life was an RKO production.
I forgot about that. Yeah. So RKO was big back in the day.
Oh, yeah.
It's
back in
sad.
the 30s and 40s, they were really, really big. And I heard that this was the movie that helped pull them out of bankruptcy back in the 30s. Or supposedly was the thing that pulled them out of bankruptcy.
It really was a big boost to them. And they did go bankrupt eventually. But this was, honestly, when you think of RKO pictures, I always think of King Kong.
yeah, for me, it's always It's a Wonderful Life, but that's just because that's at this point, I think that was one of the only movies I had seen from RKO.
I could be wrong, but I believe Universal and RKO both produced Creature from the Black Lagoon. So I might think of that one also.
Okay.
Well, I'm ready to talk about the plot if you are.
I am.
All right, listeners, if you haven't seen King Kong and you don't want the movie spoiled for you, which I do highly recommend, that I know it's older. I know in 3 years it will reach its 90th birthday, which is really incredible. I know it's older, but I do highly recommend that you check this movie out because I think you'll see kind of the magic that people have been seeing in it for so many decades. And I don't find this to be a boring movie at all. It has a very fast pace and it's very exciting to watch, especially for its time, to see how it's aged so well. So long story short, if you haven't seen King Kong and you don't want it spoiled for you, go ahead and click pause right now. Go ahead and watch the film and come back and click play and we'll be ready to talk about it. Movie director Carl Denham, played by Robert Armstrong, is about to set sail to shoot his latest picture, but his main problem is he doesn't have a pretty face to put on camera. He travels into Depression-era New York City, where he finds young Ann Darrow, played by Fay Wray, about to enter a woman's shelter. He offers her fame, fortune, the thrill of a lifetime. She accepts his offer, and the crew sets sail. Except Denham won't tell anyone their final destination. Ann meets rough, tough shipmate Jack Driscoll, played by Bruce Cabot, who at the time was not an actor, he was a waiter at a restaurant.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's funny.
I think he was a waiter for one of the producers, and they're like, hey, you want to be in a movie? Like, why don't you try out, like, for King Kong? He's like, sure.
That's so funny.
Yeah. Jack has no fondness for Anne at first, considering women always get in the way. But through their journey, his heart softens towards her. After some time, Denham finally reveals to Captain Inglehorn, played by Frank Reicher, their location is Skull Island, which she derived from a hand-drawn map. When they reach land, they find natives preparing a ritualistic ceremony of some kind. The natives want Anne, but they can't have her. That night, Anne is stolen off the ship by the natives. Back on the island, the savages offer her up as a sacrifice to none other than Kong, a gigantic ape. Quickly, Driscoll and Denham arrive on the island to pursue Anne and Kong into the jungle. But all save for Denham and Driscoll perish due to Kong throwing their log bridge into a chasm. Denham runs back to the crew to retrieve gas bombs, and Driscoll finally finds Anne atop Kong's mountain, but not before Kong rips through a giant snake, pterodactyl, and T-Rex. Driscoll and Anne escape, which prompts Kong to chase after them. Denham tosses gas bombs at Kong, which promptly knocks him out. He conceives of an idea. If they can't shoot a movie, why not bring the real deal to the public? So they put Kong as an exhibit on Broadway. Not surprisingly, Kong easily escapes, wreaks havoc through the city, finds Anne and scales the Empire State Building. Fighter planes are dispatched, a major battle ensues between the planes and Kong. Finally, Kong, being shot to death, falls to the ground where Denham approaches the dead ape. A police officer exclaims, "The plane's got him," where Denham responds, "No, it was Beauty who killed the beast," as credits roll.
So I think probably the biggest thing this movie is known for is definitely, as we said before, its special effects, namely with King Kong himself. Because I know we talked about this earlier, never have we ever seen live action incorporated with animation ever before until this movie came out. And while by today's standards, you can definitely tell it's animated, stop motion, you can definitely tell when they're using back projection and or compositing. This movie, still from a technical level and still for the year that it came out, looks incredibly well. And I would love to see the Blu-ray release of this to make out all of those fine details that you can't really see on a DVD.
I'm really grateful for how well this film has been preserved, considering how old it is. And of course, this is a cherished Warner Brothers film as well, in conjunction with RKO Radio Pictures. And the DVD that I do have is older, but it still has cleaned up the presentation very well. It is from Restored, but I absolutely am in agreement with Alan. I would love to see a Blu-ray or maybe even a new 4K restoration of this, because there are a couple scenes that I think could be cleaned up as well. And there is some details that you miss. Like, for instance, when Kong is taking her into his cave and he sets her down, and then the snake with the like hands, like the paws or whatever, the legs, attacks him. If you'll notice, Kong is picking up a flower and about to smell a flower to maybe give to Anne before the snake attacks him. Yeah, there's just all those little details in this movie that I think really warrants this film should be watched on as big a screen as possible in the best definition you can get your hands on. I really think that would pay off.
Oh, absolutely. I would too. If this was ever playing in a theater, I'd love to see it. I'm pretty sure I saw it playing at a theater around here in Chicago one time. Oh, wow. I couldn't make it because it was playing at like 11 o'clock on a Tuesday because they do that here. So I wasn't able to make it, but that would be something that if I ever can catch it, I'd love to. I would absolutely. That would be a dream come true to see this movie in the theaters and re-experience that theatrical presentation. The closest thing I did was to seeing an older film in theaters was I saw 2001: A Space Odyssey in theaters. I'm so jealous. I'm so jealous. I have it on Blu-ray, but nothing matches the theater.
It was a great experience. So
I'm sure it was.
I would love if they re-released this movie at least one more time. But the visual effects are really something to behold in this movie. And I think because we are so used to CGI and even some other 2D animation, 3D animation, whatever, I think it's pretty easy to dismiss this outright without giving it some time to think about how they went about making this movie, because there was no computer to generate any of this stuff from. They had to create what are called armatures, and it's basically a metal skeleton with screws and bolts and then they build the creature around it. So I think King Kong was only about 18 inches. But the trick was, how do they make him look 18 feet?
Right.
And make it look believable, which is really incredible.
Right. I do remember reading about how they ended up doing that process of taking, King Kong and putting him into the frame at the same time with the actual actors. We mentioned this same process in, what podcast was it? It was a very recent podcast. I think it was Back to the Future, actually. We talked about special effects and how revolutionary Part 2 was. And I briefly mentioned the process, the old process that they used to do. So what they would do is they black out part of the frame, the part of the frame that's going to have the special effects on it. So they'd film one part of the scene, like for instance, they film the actors first. Then they'd roll the tape back and film it again, but this time with the other part blackened out. And they composite those two together when you finally put them together and developed that film. So that's the old way of doing it, which, you have to film the same scene twice, which you don't necessarily have to do nowadays, or even in Back to the Future, where they could composite a little bit easier than back in 1933. And as we mentioned in that podcast, compositing and adding miniature people or other things into a frame wasn't anything new, but it was very early stages.
Exactly. And this is the earliest stage of when it was done. This really was just the creativity involved with how can we create this and make this happen? Because you're right, they did do some of that composite work. And one of the other ones that I learned about was called the Dunning process. Yeah. And that was needed for mostly like mobile scenes. So the actor would be shot on a white background, or even a blue background. No, not blue screen like we think of today, but it was kind of that neutral background. and they would kind of cast a yellow color on the actors. And then basically what they would do is they would cut them out of the frame, and then to make them translucent, and then they would bipack the film into the camera with like the visual effects shot. So when the crew is, for instance, when the crew is on the raft going through the water, that's not rear screen projection, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. That is them being shot on a white background, cut out of the background, and then they shoot the dinosaur in the water, and then they just bipack it, means putting the film together and then running it through the camera all at once.
Yeah. So it was a very manual process back in these days. It took forever.
Oh, it's incredibly manual. And even when it came down to editing, because you don't have a computer to set your markers and do cuts and anything like that, you cut it with scissors, literally cut it.
Yeah. Back in these days, they had what's called linear editing, where you don't have the luxury of Adobe Premiere Pro or Final Cut Pro to see, your entire timeline and edit different parts of the film at different times. You had to kind of do it a little bit of a different fashion, where you'd actually splice the film reel and then tape it back together for different cuts. You don't do that. You don't really see that much anymore.
No.
Usually directors will shoot on film if they're purists like Christopher Nolan, or a good recent example is Roger Eggers with The Lighthouse, are two very recent examples of film. Now, you still see film every once in a while, but it's usually, artistic for artistic reasons or for purist reasons.
Yeah, I know Spielberg always shoots on film.
Yeah.
But another thing which I think that more people might be familiar with, which is far easier to accomplish, is rear screen projection. Yeah,
that was more in this era. They'd use that. They don't use it as much. It has been used in a long time, because now we have, of course, green screen and easier ways to composite objects into a frame instead of reprojection.
Yeah, the one benefit of rear screen projection is it allowed the actors to react.
Yes,
to
that's correct.
Whatever was happening on the screen. So when, the crew are walking by the dinosaur that kind of has the spikes going along its back. I don't know any of the dinosaur names. Yep. And the one they're shooting, and then they ultimately shoot it in the eye, and it has a really drastic reaction. That was rear screen projection. And also, when Kong puts Anne in the tree while he fights the T-Rex, when Anne is in the foreground, when she's like the main subject of the shot, that's rear screen projection also. So it gives Fay Wray, the actress, the ability to react to Kong and the T-Rex fighting, which is a really cool idea.
Yeah, it is. It is, like I said earlier, you can tell by today's standards, you can tell what kind of tricks that they're using. But I don't think, at least for me, I don't think it takes away from the impact that the film had on me. In fact, I think it really maximized it, because I get to see all these old techniques that you really don't see anymore at all.
And another use of the rear screen projection is not just blowing up giant images, but also when they would have the stop motion sets, they would have tiny screens embedded within the sets. And so they would shoot a tiny picture of it. But the thing that made that difficult is with stop motion animation, you have to move the armature and the environment a fraction of a movement, and shoot a frame of it, turn the camera off, and then move it again. Shoot a frame of it, turn the camera off, move it again, which is a painstaking process.
Right. I know that for more modern examples of animation, stop animation, which really only is done by Leica Studios at this point. I think that they're the only studio who actually does full length stop motion films now. I know it's one of those things where if one frame is not right, they have to redo the entire scene.
Yep, that is exactly right. If one thing is wrong, the whole thing has to be redone. And let this be put into perspective for you. When King Kong and the T-Rex fight, that took 7 weeks to shoot that scene.
I believe it. I believe it.
And it's crazy because you have to be moving, you have to have the foreknowledge of, if I move this figure this way, then this one has to react this way.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like shooting it all in slow motion. It's kind of crazy. And what they did so for instance, when you see King Kong fighting the reptilian lizard, and you see Jack Driscoll on the right side of the frame and on the left side of the frame towards the top, that's rear screen projection miniaturized, and they had to advance that one frame at a time and hope the film wouldn't burn up while it sat there in between takes. So they did devise a system of pumping cool air onto the film so it wouldn't overheat and it'd all be ruined.
Right. Yeah, I remember that's one of the things you have to be careful of is film was flammable.
Oh, yes.
So
the nitrate.
The nitrate is kind of a flammable substance. And so once a piece of it catches on fire, it's done for. And that's your quick of the draw. But yeah, hard drives don't really catch on fire as much anymore.
Thankfully not.
Yeah.
But here's one really incredible scene that just really blew me away. Was in the scene I just described to you with Jack and Anne, and Kong is fighting the snake with legs. So here's what it took to create that scene. So first of all, in the background is a matte painting.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to say, the matte paintings looked good.
Yeah. Yeah. I actually, now that you mention it, I guess they were matte painting, because I guess I didn't really notice it.
No, the matte paintings were incredible. They had incredible depth to them.
Mm-hmm.
And I can talk about the process of that here in just a minute. So it's a matte painting in the background. And then in the actual foreground is bubbling lava. It's not real lava, but it's a bubbling substance. Real water in the background. 2 stop motion armatures fighting. And 2 rear screen projection live action actors all playing out at once.
Sounds like it's a very complex shot.
Oh, it's incredibly complex. And once you break all of this down, you think this movie should have swept the Oscars for all it achieved. And of course, it got no recognition.
Yep. The one Oscar it should have gotten wasn't even invented yet.
No, it wasn't even invented yet, unfortunately. But they did a great job with creating depth and making you think this was a real jungle.
Yeah.
Because they would have a matte painting in the background of the shot, and then a little further up would be trees and foliage, kind of layered. And then they would have a piece of glass that they would paint like a tree with like low hanging vines and shrubbery around, and then maybe even a couple miniature shrubs in front of the glass. Mm-hmm. So the glass with the tree and the vines frames the scene. And then the matte painting and the real life foliage and characters provides depth to the whole thing,
gotcha.
Which is kind of, I believe that's kind of called a parallax view,
mm-hmm.
which is a pretty good movie starring Warren Beatty. Check it out. But in order to achieve depth, like this was a giant sprawling jungle. That is the process of how they created that.
Gotcha. Yeah, I know that cell animation uses kind of a similar process, I guess.
Yes.
Where it's just like layers upon layers of animation on top of one another.
Mm-hmm. Now, another thing that I do want to draw your attention to is the sound. Because sound films hadn't been around for that long.
Yeah, they came around in mid-20s, I think, right?
Yeah, somewhere around there, they were really starting to be used more mainstream. And then, of course, feature-length films, it all transitioned into sound.
Right.
But it's not just the sound of recording people's voices. They had to think about, how do we create sounds for creatures?
Mm-hmm.
And how do we create an instrumental score, what we know as the score today? How do we create that and influence emotions and create themes for characters? So let me first talk about Murray Spivak, who created the sound effects. So Spivak recorded zoo animal sounds, such as the tiger. He slowed it down to half speed and he played it backwards.
Oh, I did hear about this for King Kong, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And nobody had done this before. I mean, just think about this. No sound effects didn't exist. Computers didn't exist. You can't create digital effects. How would you even begin to think about going about this process for creating a Tyrannosaurus Rex?
Right.
I mean, nobody's ever heard one before.
Yeah, Jurassic Park, which really popularized the T-Rex and modern sound effects, didn't come around for another, 60 so years.
Yeah, I mean, it's really incredible what he was able to achieve. And he also took a megaphone and he held it up to the microphone and he made low grumbling noises for like when King Kong was kind of doing his low little growls. And for all of this, he was actually the highest paid member on the crew for King
really?
Kong. He was Murray Spivak, the sound effects designer.
That's funny. I mean, to be fair, for the time, these sound effects are really incredible because they sound closer to more modern-like sound effects because King Kong's roar does have a bit of a similarity to it when you compare it to some of the sounds from Jurassic Park, which didn't come out for quite a long time from here.
Yeah, Spivak really created the template. He laid the groundwork for what it means to create sound effects that would sync up with the picture. And if the sound effects aren't right, nobody's going to believe it. Yeah, It looks incredible to see a giant ape interacting with live action people. But if the sound if that's not believable, that's just another part of bringing this to life, bringing the character of Kong and all of the other animals to life. And another thing they had to think about was not only creating sound effects, but also making sure they didn't interfere with the score of the film. So Australian-born Maximilian Raoul Walter Steiner worked over 8 weeks to compose the score for King Kong. And when they brought him on board, he read the script and said, there isn't music that's been made for a film like this.
Mm-hmm.
So, and this is the beginning of what we know today as the modern day film score. So what he did that is just especially poignant is tying the music into the direct actions of what's on screen, even the cuts, and of course creating themes for characters and their relationships. Alan and I talk a lot about score. Alan is a big score guy. Yeah. So I'm curious to know his take on this score and how they really all tied it in together.
I did notice that, there were beats every time, like, for instance, the chief of this tribe was walking, or even cuts for the film. There were certain things that happened per the actions that were happening on screen, which I was like kind of blown away by. This happened in 1933, and I remember that people were talking about something like this happening with Pulp Fiction and how some of the music in that really enhances the film because of how it's done. So yeah, the music in this is really, really great, not only from a technical standpoint, but also from a composition standpoint. The main theme of the tribe is probably one of my favorites. And I really did note the score when I was watching this movie and how good that the score is. Even how early it is, because at the time, like we just mentioned, they really weren't as important as they would eventually become, especially when you have no dialogue. It's a bit of a different story. So yeah, absolutely incredible score and very, of course, influential, which I feel is at the time a bit of a new process, but by today's standards, it sounds rather early it's rather more of it in its infancy. But of course, from here on out, it would become a lot more complex.
Yeah, and especially when you think back to films at the time, when they did have music with them, which wasn't very often. The music was continuously played through different scenes throughout the film. Yeah. It always had a very, kind of a percussion-y, instrumental tone to it. I think it's really incredible that that Steiner created themes for each of the characters. So, for instance, listen for Anne's theme. As her and Jack escape Kong off the cliff, her theme rapidly increases as the scene intensifies. And this just hadn't been done before. Like Alan mentioned, the steps, and it did blow me away upon this watching of the film. The steps where the tribal chief is walking and the music hits those beats as well.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Steiner also wanted to make sure the score brought about emotion. We see this still today, like in Interstellar, parts of that score made people come to tears.
Yeah.
Because of how closely it drew in with the action and stirred emotions in the listeners. So this is really where it began. And I think it's still hard to dismiss, though, and not even think about it because we're so used to all of this, though. And back then, nobody had really thought of, like, what if we made a musical score that had a theme for each character and directly tied in with what we see going on the screen? Because what we saw on the screen and the music happening in films around that time really didn't have much connection with each other.
Yeah. Now, there have been like themes and familiar motifs popping up in music way before this, way before even films were a thing back in the early 1600s. You know, that's always been a thing. But in terms of relating it to something happening on screen with a actual film, this was a really new process than anything that we had seen before. So yeah, by a composition standpoint, pairing that to what we see on screen, it's incredible.
A few critics at the time didn't really like that, like we were bringing up when the chief was walking and the music was hitting the beats with each of his steps. A lot of critics at the time called that Mickey Mousing.
I mean, I can see why, because I think Steamboat Willie had come out no more than a few years before this.
Right. Yeah, and they felt they're kind of Mickey Mousing around. It could be seen as comical to tie the music so closely with the actions.
Yeah.
Such as when Kong is tickling Anne.
Yeah.
Do you remember that part? Yeah.
Yep.
But the creators felt that this was so new to audiences, they had to go a little further to help them along, to bring the music to the forefront of their consciousness, of see how this music can relate and give you emotions to what's happening and bring it all together. So for that, I don't really have an issue with it. I understand what the critics were saying, but especially for a film in 1933. Now, doing it today, I think people would maybe not think about it as much or maybe find it a little odd, but it makes sense for the time period. And even 9 years after this movie, we see this becoming far more mainstream to tie the music into the actions on screen. I'm thinking back to our review of Casablanca. So when Rick comes into the room with Ingrid Bergman and one of them flips on the lights, we have that musical cue, that revelation of kind of a shock of what's going on here.
Right.
Now, after King Kong had been out for 5 years, they were going to re-release it, but that pesky production code we mentioned earlier was getting very moral with their thoughts. They didn't like when Kong was peeling Anne's clothes off. They felt that was way too sexual and kind of getting into rape territory, they said. So they're like, we probably should cut that out. And they wanted to cut out like 5 minutes of violence, which doesn't really make any sense how a movie could be released in 33 and be fine. And then in 38, they're like, wait a minute. I think we need to go back and edit this movie.
Yeah. I don't know what the standard is for that. It could have been a rule change from 1933 to 1938 for whatever reason. But yeah, it is interesting that a movie that was released in 1933 is now being censored when it goes for re-release 5 years after its initial release. That does seem really strange.
And the thing that always really troubles me about movies being edited back in this time period is they didn't have the Control S function. You can't just save the movie. You've got a reel of the movie, or it's probably like 10 reels of it, and they're scattered all over the world. And what they're going to do is they're going to cut it from like master reel or whatever it's called, and then that new film will be the one that's distributed, and hopefully somebody will have preserved this in their archives. I know there's a lot of contention and wondering about Metropolis.
Yeah, that's probably one of the biggest examples, or one of the earliest examples of a film that had a lot of editing done to it for one reason or another, and a lot of those edits have kind of just been lost. And now we're trying to scramble and find all the pieces we possibly can to put it back together. And I don't know if we found it all. I think we found most of it. But yeah, that's a really early example of a film that has been lost to time because of editing.
And thankfully, they've done a good job of restoring it, from what I understand.
Yeah.
And the same goes for King Kong here. There was a decent amount of footage that was cut out. And for the longest time, you could only watch the cut down version of the film. So what you're watching is the restored original cut for the most part. There is a big sequence that I'm going to talk about here in just a minute that nobody has yet to find, which would be incredible if they did find it. So, but thankfully, the editor who did have to cut down this film, he just took the cuts that he made and he just took it home with him.
Oh wow.
And they found it in his basement, like when he passed away or something, or a long time afterwards. He's like, hey, I have the missing scenes from King Kong. And they're like, well, let's incorporate it back in. So I'm really glad that what we watched for this review and what you can buy today is the restored cut of the film.
Right.
Now, there is one missing sequence that I just brought up, and it is called the Lost Spider Pit sequence. Does that ring any bells? Have you heard of that one?
I don't know.
Okay. So the Lost Spider Pit sequence happens when, right after the sailors are chased out of the water from like the Brachiosaurus, and then they run onto the log. Okay. So if you'll notice, when the sailors are running and they're way far away from the Brachiosaurus, they keep looking back over their shoulder.
Mm-hmm.
That is because there's still some stills from it and concept creations of it. They're being chased by an Arsinotherium, which is like a giant rhino, but with a bisected horn. It looks awesome.
I'm sure it does.
It does. So they were originally being chased by an Arsinotherium, but that was replaced with a Styracosaurus, which, look it up. I don't know how to describe it to you. Everybody knows what that is once you see what the picture is. Mm-hmm. That was actually originally created for Willis O'Brien's film Creation, which got scrapped, and then they said, let's use it as chasing the sailors onto the log. But then that was scrapped as well. And finally, in the sequel to this film, Son of Kong, they got to use that Styracosaur.
Yes.
So this does create a logical gap of why don't the sailors run off the other direction of the log? Kong's on one side. Why don't they just go back the other way? Well, that's because supposedly there is this Styracosaur or Arsinotherium chasing them. And there are still images of this actually happening. One of the things that I think is really incredible is when Peter Jackson was filming his 2005 remake of King Kong, he came to his people, his crew and those at Weta, and he said, what if we shot the Lost Spider Pit sequence, created armatures, and shot it in black and white and created all new sound effects. And it's incredible, if you haven't seen it, what they were able to do with this.
Oh, I actually haven't seen that.
Oh, okay.
So I guess I gotta watch it now.
Yeah.
I also haven't seen King Kong, the Peter Jackson remake either. I've only seen bits and pieces of it.
And that is one thing that Jackson did, is when he did do his film, he made sure to have, after they fall off the log, they fall into the pit, which was the original spider pit sequence. And they did have the Styracosaur chasing them, which is pretty cool.
Gotcha.
So in a 1960s movie magazine, they published a shot from the lost sequence, and everybody was like, what? We've never seen this. This is, in 30 years, this is incredible. It's very possible that Cooper, he cut it from the film. He said it was too shocking, actually, for theaters at the time. Yeah, Cooper said it's just too shocking for theaters, but I think everybody believes it just threw the pacing off. So,
gotcha.
But Cooper did cut it and possibly just burned it. Because that's what he would do with cuts, is he's like, well, see, they had no forward thinking of preservation for 100 years into the future, like we're talking about it now.
Right.
So they would just burn it and throw it in the trash. But Peter Jackson is hoping that this sequence still remains intact, maybe somewhere in Asia, because apparently in Asia, there is a lot of footage that has yet to be gone through from these very old films.
Gotcha. Okay.
So Peter Jackson and Frank Darabont, who created a little film called The Shawshank Redemption.
Sounds like an indie film.
Sounds like, yeah, I think it was like direct to DVD or something. So Frank Darabont, who did Shawshank and The Green Mile, and Rick Baker, who is a huge visual effects artist, plus Weta Workshopped, they did use the original script, because you can read the original script where this scene remains intact, old stills and original drawings to recreate the scene. And I highly recommend you check it out. It is on the disc. So if you pick up the Blu-ray, I guarantee it'll be there. It's on my DVD collection. And it's really cool because they did blend their new scene with the original Kong scene to make it one seamless sequence.
Gotcha.
And they did re-record new sound effects. For the Styracosaur, they actually used Fay Wray's scream and slowed it down for the Styracosaur roar.
Really?
Yeah.
That's one way to go about it.
So I do hope that someday in the future we will have a newly restored cut of Kong with never before seen footage, maybe on its 100th anniversary. That would just be incredible.
Yeah. One day they just wait until its 100th anniversary, which is coming up. How old is it now? Can it come out 33?
Yeah, so it's 87 years old.
Yeah, it's getting pretty close. It's 2020 currently.
Yeah.
So about 13 years from now.
13 years from now, Kong will reach its 100th anniversary. It's incredible. So I think the only thing that people, especially today, would find issues with this movie is there's no real character development or character arcs at all.
Yeah, the characters are rather flat. I think the captain is probably the only one who actually gets something to him. Everybody else is pretty cardboard. And even the captain himself is pretty cardboard.
Yeah, there's really no character development. There's some fun character moments where Driscoll and Anne have this funny banter where he smacks her in the mouth on accident, which I found to be funny. And then he's like, you probably should just stay below deck and stay out of our way. And she says, the whole voyage?
Yeah.
And then he's like, women are always getting in the way. Women are a nuisance. And then he does come to have this affection for Anne, which I kind of like. But of course, some of the acting is over the top. But mind you, they're coming off of film used to be silent pictures where you really did have to overreact in order to really convey what's going on with the audience. So the art of acting with your dialogue and voices really hadn't been around for that long.
Right. Yeah. They were going more towards stage play, which is similar to silent films, but, it's not a movie. So, yeah, there is a good reason why it's rather over the top here. And compared to some movies that would even come after this, as because it's one of the earlier talkies. This was it really that big of a thing back in 1933. This is relatively new to have voices on screen. So yeah.
And the creators also knew they never really wanted to make this movie about the human characters.
Mm-hmm.
The main focus was Kong himself.
And I can see why. And I can definitely see that in the movie that they have here. A lot of the focus is on Kong and developing Kong. Even Kong himself, I think, has the most personality of anybody else on screen here.
And that's something that was a surprise to audience in 33, is that they actually had emotional connections and feelings when Kong died at the end for an inanimate object.
Right. Yeah, something that literally is only animated because the film it was shot on is at a certain speed and his movements are a certain way to make it feel more lifelike. And
of course, today we love characters that don't exist and will never exist, that are animated or CGI creations, but we still love them. So this was really the first time that audiences connected with an inanimate character, which was Kong.
Right.
And of course, they did an incredible job. I know one of the studio executives said that he loves the way that Kong's fur moved in each shot. And that wasn't even on purpose. That was just from moving the armature. It gave the illusion that Kong, like wind was blowing through his hair. And they would put kind of like a tiny balloon inside of Kong. So it would give the appearance that he was breathing. And the filmmakers, as I said, really wanted Kong to be the forefront of the film. And they really wanted this to be a visual story because it's all about the thrills of watching people interact with dinosaurs and trying to escape. It's an adventure film. And keep in mind that long character-driven epics would not come out for another 6 years when Gone with the Wind won Best Picture in 1939 and was 4 hours long. So I would say within this decade, we would come to see big character-driven films come into their own.
Now, by today's standards, the character of Anne doesn't really hold up very well, I don't think. No. She's very much a product of the 30s. Very much a damsel in distress that's really the only thing that her character is. So had this movie come out in 2020, it would not fly. By no means. It would be considered maybe even a bit racist, if not a lot of racist, and sexist because the only thing Anne does in this movie is scream for the most part and always saved by the man. So it's very fun. It's actually kind of cool in some ways to see what life was or what films and things were like back in the 30s compared to now in terms of their social context.
Yeah, you're right. The social context is absolutely different because women had just gotten the right to vote 13 years before this film was made in 1920. And so, women weren't as prominent in society and didn't have the same type of role there was. But as Alan said, it is good to see how I would probably say civilization has kind of progressed and how gender roles have progressed in that sort of fashion, at least. But this is, but I still think some of these stories have their place of the damsel in distress. I still think that's still a worthy type of storytelling because it does reinforce positive virtues in male figures of taking care of women and risking all to save a woman. Now, does that mean the woman can't fight back? No, I still think the woman should fight back and feel empowered in that sort of context, which at least we see Anne trying to escape.
Yeah.
But I do think she probably could do a bit more. It's not as bad as the 1976 Kong. You want to talk about not flying? That's not going to fly.
I took a look at the poster and I was like, ooh, that did not age well. Because the poster has King Kong standing one leg on each of the Twin Towers.
Yeah.
That one does not age very well either.
No, and that whole movie is about Kong giving pervert eyes towards Anne, trying to rip off her clothes. It's disgusting.
I also saw the score. It's like a 5.6 on IMDb. So from what I understand, it's not very well regarded. It's either the 1933 King Kong or Peter Jackson's 2005 remake King Kong that are considered, or that I've actually heard about. I totally forgot that there was a 1976 remake until I was getting ready for this review.
Yeah, I'll talk about that at the end because I watched that when I was like 6 or 7 and I didn't like it as well, but that one would definitely not fly with today's culture. Oh dear.
Ooh, no.
And I do think there are some cheesy elements to this film, especially when they do land on the island and they come upon the natives who are dressed up in Kong costumes, beating their chest, dancing in a circle, just saying Kong, Kong. Dun, 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 dun. Kong, Kong. Yeah. I'm like, oh gosh.
I mean, it's some great music, but yeah, you're right. It is kind of cheesy.
Yeah, the tribal theme is great. Yeah. But the actual dancing like that is very silly.
Yeah. Well, since we're on the topic of the tribe, I do want to talk about briefly the set design of this entire movie because, man, does this movie look really good. Mm-hmm. Like this tribal like city looks probably one of the better parts of the film because it all looks very, very, very practical. And that giant gate behind them looks so, so good. There's a shot later on after they take Anne and tie her up to the 2 posts for Khan to come and get her, where you can see a little bit of compositing of all the tribal members on the top of the gate, I guess is what it is. But man, does this movie look really, really good.
Yeah, and some of that is built to scale. Clearly not the whole thing. Yeah. But some of that is incredible. And yeah, the composite shots together are, I would say, very believable, especially for 33. And even watching today, I didn't even think that, that's a miniature or anything like that. It's really incredible what they did with that. And a fun fact is this wall is in Gone with the Wind.
Oh, really?
When Scarlet and Red are escaping Georgia, they drive in front of a giant wall, and this is the wall, and they've literally burned it for that movie.
Really?
Yeah, and clearly, composite shots and whatnot. Yeah. But it is the wall from King Kong that they burned down.
Interesting. I guess I need to watch Gone with the Wind then. Still haven't seen that movie.
Oh. Next time we'll watch it. We're together. But yeah, the set design is really incredible. And even with the jungle aspects, I think they did a good job of maybe not necessarily creating a realistic jungle, but more of a mythical jungle you would imagine in kind of a fantasy. And this is supposed to be back in time where, civilization has never really touched any of this world. And I do love the villages, which Cooper and Shodasak got from their real life travels of Africa. And you can watch films like I mentioned earlier, Grass. These are very realistic recreations of those villages they saw.
Gotcha.
When they went into Africa. And I do also think they did a great job even when it comes to New York, the concrete jungle. Mm-hmm. Where that composite shot is absolutely incredible of the audience looking at Kong up on there. That is so believable.
Yeah, it was pretty much from there when they're displaying Kong to the very end that I remember seeing of the movie. So yeah, I remember him breaking free from his restraints on stage, then climbing up the building and reaching his hand in there and grabbing random people until he finally found Anne. And then scaling the Empire State Building, which is a very famous shot of him not only scaling the Empire State Building, but also, on top of the Empire State Building and fighting those fighter jets. I think we noted at least I noted in our Cloverfield review that there is one frame of Kong fighting the fighter planes that shows up in that movie for just a very brief moment. It's just one frame I think it's towards the very end.
Yeah. Anybody who's made a monster type film or big creature film, they have to give homage to King Kong, it seems like, because this is the one that sparked so many imaginations and really got that genre going. Mm-hmm. I think one of the biggest themes of this film, probably. I don't think there's a lot to this movie, but I think one of the bigger themes is that civilization is more brutal than just the natural world, because man is the one capable of thinking and rationally killing and destroying, whereas we see these creatures in their primal environment. And when man is the one, Carl Denham is the one that brings this terror upon New York City, all in the hopes of profiting. It's all based upon, he's not an archaeologist or expeditionist, anything like that. He just wants the money. And what happens is he leaves a horrible wake of destruction that he doesn't seem to be remorseful, but the film doesn't give us time to wonder about those things. But I do love that aspect of the concrete jungle where man brings their modern machines and destroys something incredible that it could be the last of his kind. Right.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. It's really cool to see how this man, Captain whatever, I forget his name actually, but this man, he brings this, what he considers to be the eighth wonder of the world, to show off to everybody, literally just to make some money, just make himself rich. And then because of that more selfish act, he kind of almost kills hundreds of thousands of people in the wake of it because he wants to make money. And he finds this idea when he isn't really too concerned about the locals. He has heard about Kong and he wants to go and film Kong to make a movie out of it, to make money that way. And then later decides to take Kong back with him to the States. So in reality, his pursuit has always been about money. And finally, when he gets what he wants in a way that he thinks is going to be even better than his original plan, of course, it all kind of goes south. And next thing we know, Kong is climbing the Empire State Building, which at this point had just been built in the Americas. So yeah, it's a really kind of a crazy story about this man's lust for money is the thing that causes not only his downfall, but danger to everybody else around him.
And he mentioned in the end of the film, it was beauty that killed the beast.
Yeah.
But with in the context, it's honestly greed that killed Kong. It was his greed. I mean, he ruined all of the villagers' lives, and they're done for.
Yep.
And tons of people in New York are dead as well, and definitely traumatized. He's going to jail, probably.
Yeah. Oh yeah, he's going to jail for a while.
So I do think that is something that people can easily miss, is that is kind of also the moral of the story. You can find a moral within it, is that man's greed for greater and greater power and accumulation of wealth in an unhealthy fashion will ultimately have a very destructive means. And he's not a very good steward of creation. He is exploiting creation for his own benefit.
Yeah, he is.
So originally, Kong was actually not going to die on the Empire State Building.
Really?
No. So in Edgar Wallace's first draft of the script, he had, it was actually going to be quite different. Ann Darrow and the director Carl Denham weren't even going to have known each other or even been a part of the same expedition. Basically, Anne and some other people were on the island. I believe they were shipwrecked on there. Maybe that's a holdover from creation. And then Carl Denham would come by and just toss his gas bombs to save these people, which is a far more altruistic thing, making his character better. But he did decide to continue to profit off of Kong, and he took him to a circus in New York. And Kong would wreak havoc on everything, but he was originally supposed to be struck by lightning and die.
Gotcha. Okay. That would have been a strange ending, to get struck by lightning.
Not as climactic in that. We do see Kong get struck by lightning in King Kong vs. Godzilla in the 60s film.
Okay.
Which doesn't kill him, but gives him super strength.
Oh, okay.
It's
That's what I
stupid.
was wondering when you said didn't kill him. I was like, oh, so it did the opposite, didn't it?
It superpowered him to fight Godzilla.
Interesting. Very interesting.
And one other thing before we come to our conclusion here is I would say it's a pretty famous liked scene of when Kong smashes into the train, the above ground train.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't in the original cut. So originally they felt the pacing wasn't quite right. Plus there was 13 reels of footage and people in Hollywood were very superstitious at the time.
Yeah.
So there couldn't be 13 reels of footage. So they added a 14th reel and ensured that, and that was when he just thought, why don't we just have Kong wreaking havoc through the city some more? And that's when Cooper just came up with the idea of Kong disrupting the train and smashing it, chewing on those people.
Gotcha.
Well, Alan, what is your rating and recommendation for King Kong?
King Kong is finally, now that I've finally seen it, is a film that I would love to own on Blu-ray, if not to see those same special effects in a higher definition. Because, as I said before, this film looks really, really good. Not only does it look good, but it also sounds good. Not just because of its sound effects, but also its music. It makes sense why this movie is as influential as it is today. Now, of course, it's way out of date. It's from the 30s, and there are things in here that, if made today, would not fly. But that's something I don't think detracts from this movie at all, because it is more of a period piece than it is anything else now. So, because of its achievements in filmmaking, not only special effects, but also acting and music and sound effects, it achieves a lot, which would be only expounded upon with more and more films being released in Hollywood and so on and so on and so forth. So, yeah, I absolutely love King Kong. And now that I actually got to see the whole movie this time, it is kind of nice to say that I've seen the original King Kong. So, yeah, definitely one I would definitely check out, honestly, if you're curious to see some of the early days of film, not only film, but also special effects and acting and music and things like that, how it was incorporated. So, yeah, at the end of the day, 8 out of 10. Yeah, very good movie. High recommend.
King Kong is the film that made me fall in love with movies at the tender age of 5. 20 years later, it has and will remain my ultimate favorite film. Honestly, there probably wouldn't be a silver screen guide without King Kong. From the moment I saw it on our little tube TV, eating sour cream and onion Pringles, I knew I wanted to work with movies someday. King Kong allowed my imagination to thrive, to open upon new creative possibilities that would shape my love for storytelling. I'm so happy to review this film as an adult and hopefully introduce a new generation of film lovers and storytellers to the magic this film holds, despite it's nearing its 90th anniversary. I love King Kong and the impact it has made on my life. I'm giving it an 11 out of 10, my highest recommendation.
I figured that was going to happen.
You saw that coming.
I saw that one coming, yeah.
Well, Kong was not going to disappear from the big screen anytime soon after this film came out. RKO saw what massive success they had on their hands, so they rushed a sequel into production. If you can believe it, Alan, the sequel came out the same year.
You know, I was looking at, when I was doing research for this, I kept seeing Son of Kong, and how it came out in 1933. And I was like, wait, there were 2 King Kong movies in 1933? That's ridiculous. Mm-hmm. So I guess that would make sense because of the success of King Kong that they would rush a sequel into production. Of course, I haven't seen it. Have you seen it, though?
I haven't seen it. That one has always eluded me. I've never really given it much thought, honestly, but...
Gotcha.
I believe the Blu-ray is around $5 right now, so I'm going to get it. I'm going to pick it up and add it to the collection.
Yeah.
Because I do own all of the other King Kong movies except 1 or 2 of them. But nevertheless, I have heard the sequel doesn't really compare well to the original. And especially because they made this... I have no idea how they made the movie that fast.
Yeah, that's crazy.
I don't think they use clearly existing models that they've already created, and I don't think they use as many visual effects in that movie. I know it still is a sequel because Carl Denham, played by Robert Armstrong, comes back. Maybe Fay Wray comes back. A few of the same people. The Asian guy who peels potatoes.
Yeah.
He's in it, I think.
Really?
But nevertheless, keep in mind here. So King Kong came out to the public April 7th, 1933. Son of Kong, the sequel, came out December 22nd, 1933.
Yikes. That's fast.
About 8 months.
Yeah.
Ish.
And usually films in today's time take about a year or so to complete from start, not from the time they begin filming to the time that they release. It's roughly about a year. That's ridiculous.
It's surprising, and I think it is possible because, I mean, no studio would cannibalize their film in today's day and age with a sequel, because a studio wants to make sure to have theatrical sales and then home video sales. And if they release the sequel within the same year, then it wouldn't be financially smart to do something like that. Now, we just did review both Back to the Future films, and 2 and 3 came out within 6 months of each other. The same thing happened to Matrix 2 and 3 because those films were shot simultaneously.
Right.
So that's not unheard of. Usually that doesn't go over quite as well because, I don't know, the hype, and there's no such thing as really hype back then. I guess this movie created hype, you could say.
Maybe, yeah. I know it did. I know it grossed the most money at the time in the box office, which by today's standards is kind of puny, but I mean, then again, it was back in the 30s, so yeah.
Yeah, and I think if you adjust inflation for like Gone with the Wind, it is like the highest grossing film ever. It grossed like $5 billion or something insane like that.
Right. I did do an inflation calculation real quick.
Oh, okay.
And for the profit of $650,000. So it got, let's see here, 1,702,000.
Okay. Yeah.
Wait,
which would be huge
hang on.
for 33.
1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 17 million. There it is.
Oh, okay.
There it is. Okay. $17 million in today's money. And that was just by profit alone. So if it's 2 million, who knows how much that is.
Yeah. And that's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
We can't emphasize enough how huge this was at 1933.
Yeah. In the box office, it pulled in about $52.4 million in today's money, which is about, so that's 2 million back in 1913. So that's almost 52.3 or $4 million if you were to adjust for inflation.
Yeah, which is crazy money for back then. Hence, they said Kong is a money-making machine. Let's put out the sequel as quick as we can.
Yeah.
And they didn't do a third film. Marion C. Cooper came back in the 40s with Mighty Joe Young.
Okay.
Which Disney remade into a not very good movie. But that is another movie about a giant ape. And some of the same crew came to work on Mighty Joe Young. I haven't seen the original. I would love to. It's much happier than this movie. I don't think you could call this a happy movie.
Mm-hmm.
But Mighty Joe Young is... So Cooper did do 3 giant gorilla films. I'd love to see the other 2. When I do see them, I will review them on Letterboxd. So follow me over there, Corbin on Letterboxd. And in 1962, Kong would come back to the big screen. This time with a Japanese audience, but Universal did come on board and make a American cut, which isn't as good as the Japanese cut, I've heard, with King Kong versus Godzilla.
Okay.
Now, I do own that on DVD. I just watched it recently. I don't recommend it. I don't like it. Maybe if you're a kid, you'll like it.
Mm-hmm.
And then 4 years later, in 1966, King Kong Escapes, which is basically a James Bond movie, but with King Kong.
Interesting.
I do like that one. You should watch it. It's insane.
Very interesting.
It's so over the top. It's hilarious. It's awesome. And they did have a children's TV show at the time in 66 about King Kong with, he had kids were his friends.
Really?
Yeah.
There seem to be a lot of those. Rambo had a TV show with kids.
Yeah, that's true.
There seem to be a lot of shows off of things. This is one of the things that spawned that.
I've never seen the cartoon. I didn't really know it existed until not that long ago. I'd be interested in watching it.
Mm-hmm.
And then 10 years later, Dino De Laurentiis, who I know isn't that popular in the movie community, kind of made some shoddy type films. It was just called King Kong with a very young Jeff Bridges.
Mm-hmm.
And introducing Jessica Lange. That is on Prime Video. I did own it on VHS when I was a kid. I just rewatched it last weekend. I don't recommend it. I gave it a 5 out of 10.
Ooh.
So it's got a lot of issues. And it's probably one you shouldn't let your kids watch because it's a little risque, I'd say. Not a little. It's a lot of risque. It's weird. Kong does die at the end, but with helicopters with machine guns on them, and it's super violent. I mean, blood everywhere. Super violent. And of course, it might create some uneasy feelings in people because Kong does not scale the Empire State Building. As Alan mentioned earlier, Kong scales the World Trade Center. And that is where the big climax occurs at the World Trade Center. Which sadly is no longer standing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, here's probably the most interesting King Kong sequel that I desperately want my hands on, but it's like going to be impossible. So 10 years after that, they made a sequel. Dino De Laurentiis made a sequel where Kong didn't die. He gets a heart transplant.
Oh.
Even though his body's riddled with bullets.
Where he got the heart to put in it.
And he fell all the way from the World Trade Center.
Right.
Yeah, what heart would they put in it? So it's called King Kong Lives, starring Linda Hamilton, who we're going to be talking about next week.
That's right. Yeah.
Linda Hamilton, who is the lead Sarah Connor in The Terminator.
That's right.
Well, King Kong Lives, good luck watching that movie. The DVD is out of print. I think you can pick it up for about $80 used on Amazon.
Oh.
And there is not a digital version. You cannot purchase a digital version of the movie.
Huh. Well, so yeah, that one's kind of out of the picture then.
Yeah, unless you're willing to drop a lot of money for a used disc, that may or may not work.
Yeah.
It's going to be pretty hard to watch.
Yeah.
And then, of course, in 2005, Peter Jackson remade the film to critical acclaim.
Right.
It was considered a masterpiece. It was considered just one of the greatest films ever made, and especially for the new millennium.
Mm-hmm.
I know Roger Ebert gave it a 4 out of 4 and dubbed it one of the great films, and has a really high Metascore rating, and the Metascore is so high it is considered one of the great films, it says. I just rewatched it recently. I really love certain elements of it. It's very long. The theatrical cut is 3 hours. The extended cut is 3.5 hours.
Yikes.
Like I said, things I love, things I think when I saw it in theaters in 2005 when I was 10, I thought some of it was kind of silly and kind of boring. It's a 3-act structure. For what we missed in character development in this film, it is drastically made up for in Peter Jackson's film, because the first hour is essentially character development, and an hour into the movie, they get to Skull Island.
Oh, wow.
And then Skull Island takes an hour, and then about the last hour, I would say, to maybe 45 minutes is in New York.
Okay.
So it's long.
Yeah, I know I've seen... there's a part of them in Skull Island that I know I've seen. And I think it... And just like bits and pieces here and there. But yeah, I have yet to see it all the way through.
And then, of course, Warner Brothers just put out 3 years ago, 2017, Kong Skull Island, which was a very fun IMAX experience. Everybody was fairly lukewarm about that movie. And
yeah, I don't remember hearing too much about it after it came out. I think, and we watched it, didn't we, together?
Well, yeah, we did. We watched it with another one of our friends.
I barely remember anything about that movie, I'm going to be honest.
I mean, it's a great cast. It's Brie Larson, Tom Hiddleston, Samuel L. Jackson, John Goodman. Great cast, but it's okay. I found some elements to be disappointing. I still liked it. I own it. It's still very fun to watch. It's lighthearted. But that King Kong is going to come back on the big screen this year with King Kong versus Godzilla. This is their big universe monster mashup.
I wonder how that one's going to turn out now that... Because, let's see... Let me think here for a second. Kong Skull Island came out. Then it was Godzilla, King of Monsters, right?
No, first it was Gareth Edwards' Godzilla film.
Okay.
And then it was Kong Skull Island. And then last year was Godzilla, King of Monsters, which I really liked, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And then this year, technically King Kong vs. Godzilla was supposed to come out in March, I think, but it's been pushed back towards the end of the year.
Gotcha. Okay.
And we've seen no trailers. I have a feeling we're going to get a trailer during the Super Bowl, which already occurred because this is going to be released in the future after the Super Bowl.
That's true.
So yeah, wasn't that trailer great in the Super Bowl, Alan?
Yeah, assuming it was there, I'm sure it was awesome.
It was amazing.
The Super Bowl that I probably didn't watch because I don't have cable.
I think it's going to be on a local channel.
Here's the thing, though. I don't even think I have a cable with me.
You can go buy bunny ears for like $5 at Dollar General.
Maybe I will.
Okay. So I'm very excited to see what they do with King Kong versus Godzilla. They set the lowest of bars in 1962 with the Japanese film, and then Universal ruined it, adding, I mean, it is so boring. It's awful. I'm so disappointing. And of course, the last time we saw stop motion with Kong was Son of Kong, because after that, they've just used men in giant gorilla suits.
Yeah, I did see a couple of stills from the 1976, and I saw Kong, and yeah, he looks like a man in a suit instead of, anything else.
Yeah, it's not good. But you know what? I already own King Kong vs. Godzilla and King Kong Escapes. I might as well complete the collection and pick up Dino De Laurentiis' King Kong. It's like $4 on DVD on Amazon right now.
Oh, yeah, that's like nothing.
Just so I can have it a part of the Kong collection.
Yep.
Which I'm really bummed about. How am I ever going to own King Kong Lives? Maybe it'll get a Criterion release and they'll bring it back.
We can hope. They just announced, of course, a few weeks ago by the time this is released, that a bunch of Netflix films are going to Criterion, and there's a couple of Michael Bay movies on Criterion, so it's entirely possible. We'll see if it actually happens.
That would be incredible. I would buy it, of course, day one.
Yes.
Well, Alan, thanks for joining me.
Sure thing. I'm glad I finally got to watch King Kong. First time.
I am so happy that you have now seen King Kong, and I really do hope this review will bring this film to more viewers' attention and will hopefully reignite a new audience. I don't want these old films to get lost in the shuffle of the barrage of new films we're getting.
Yeah.
Because there really is something special, and it's not just nostalgia. For me, I think there really is, just as we talked about at length here, there really is something special. And that's why this podcast was a little longer and more in-depth about how they created this film, because this was the starting point for what we know today as modern cinema, with visual effects and sound effects and all of this really incredible stuff. This is where it all began with King Kong. So, of course, I adore this film and I will always love it. I can't wait to pass it on to my children someday. And hopefully you have loved it just as I have, or maybe you're rediscovering or discovering it for the first time. So, listeners, make sure to comment. That's the question after the show. When did you first watch King Kong, and what is your first memory of it? I can't wait to read those. I'm very excited. Well, next week we will be coming back with a little bit more stop motion, if I'm not mistaken, I should say.
I believe you are correct. Yeah, a little bit, not too much, but there is a little bit.
That's right. We will be kicking off our Terminator movie review series, where Alan and I will be reviewing, how many movies are there now? Like 17?
Well, let me think here. There's it feels like it. It sure feels like it. There's Terminator, Terminator 2, Terminator 3. Terminator Salvation, Terminator Genesis, Terminator Dark Fate. So 7, I think. If I counted it right.
6.
6? Yeah, 6.
Anyways, I'm pretty excited to review these movies because I know people love the originals. And then with 3, they're like, what? And then with Salvation, they violently turned on it. And then Genesis was like, people's heads exploded with how much they hated it. I think you're going to be surprised on my take with it, though. Mm-hmm. And I've heard mostly positive things about Dark Fate. Unfortunately, it was a box office bomb.
Yeah, no, it failed so bad. I heard nothing. I forgot it came out. I forgot that anybody said anything about it because no one talked about it. It made the Oscar shortlist, I think, for visual effects, but didn't get a nomination. No. That was the last thing I heard about it. So it's been kind of a rocky road for that one, it sounds like.
Yeah, it is. I'm looking forward to seeing it, though. And I'm looking forward to just reviewing these movies in succession because the only movie I own is Terminator Salvation, which means I've watched it the most of all of them.
Yeah, I know I have seen all of them except for 3 and Dark Fate. I've seen 1, 2, 4, and 5.
I'm excited.
Yeah. I'm excited to see what they're like in succession because I've only seen them in I think Salvation was the first one. Then it was Terminator. Then it was Terminator 2. And then it was Terminator Genesis. So they're all out of order for me.
That's basically how I came to the franchise as well. Except before Genesis, I saw Terminator 3. I think people might be surprised on if my take holds from when I did first watch the Terminator. People might be surprised with my take on it. I'm interested to hear your take, Alan. Maybe my mind has really changed with this movie. I don't know. I'm curious. So, listeners, make sure you watch The Terminator, which is iconic unto itself. Make sure you watch that before next Monday. So thank you for joining me on my special birthday pick podcast. And I kind of also want to know, I'm just curious, listeners, what movie would you pick to review on your birthday if you could do that? So I want to know what movies are special to you as well. And we will see you next week, listeners, with The Terminator. Hey listeners, it's Corbin. Don't forget to check out the exciting links in the description below that will connect you with more great movie reviews for your listening pleasure, and our YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter page, and of course our official website where you can read great articles and sign up for our free weekly newsletter. Also, if you want exclusive bonus content such as extra movie reviews, movie commentaries, and our thoughts on the latest movie news and trailers, plus more, then check out our Patreon page. It's a great way to help keep this show free, and it gives you great content that's yours to keep. All of that and more is found in the description below. Don't forget to subscribe whether you're on YouTube, Apple, Google, or Stitcher, or your favorite podcast service. And while you're at it, please leave us a 5-star review so other movie lovers can more easily find our podcast. We love talking about movies, and we love talking about them with you. So don't forget to share with your friends and family, and we'll see you next week, listeners. The Silver Screen Guide podcast is edited and produced by Allen and Corbin. Intro and outro music is created by Thomas Rankin. The thoughts and opinions herein expressed are those of the individual and do not necessarily represent those held by Silver Screen Guide. Silver Screen Guide is not affiliated with any company or individual involved with the creation of this movie or TV show. No portion of the podcast may be used without express written permission from Silver Screen Guide.